So yes, thank you for that introduction. I'm the research director at Simpliflying. We are an aviation consultancy, and we also now run a testing portals for airlines and airports. If you go to fittofly.travel, you can find more information on there. So if we go to the next slide, and I guess I wanted to set the scene by talking about a story here from the UK. And those of you who are from the UK will know who this is. This is probably the BBC's most high-profile political journalist. He runs a flagship program on Sundays. His name is Andrew Marr. And last week he admitted that he'd received COVID and he had to miss a week off work. And there were a lot of, despite being double vaccinated, there were a lot of sensational headlines about this, about, you know, how could this happen? He's been vaccinated, but he still got sick. But the fact of the matter is, what this story shows is it points to our future, because actually this is a 61-year-old man. He's a previous cancer sufferer, so he's very, clinically vulnerable. He didn't feel well. He was off work for a week. He came back to work. He didn't go to hospital. That actually shows that the vaccines work, because a year ago he would have been in the intensive care unit in hospital. And I guess it also comes back to, there's a wide misunderstanding about the jobs that vaccines are there to do. You know, ideally the vaccines aren't to stop us catching the virus. The vaccines are there to stop us getting sick. And that leads us on to, if we move on to the next slide, onto a widely discussed editorial that I'm sure some of you have seen, that appeared in the Straits Times in Singapore, where Singapore's trade, finance, and health ministers, where they gave a blueprint for what they saw as the new normal, where essentially we're going to be living with the pandemic in the long term. As they say, the good news is it's possible to live normally with us in our midst. The virus will continue and will thereby survive in our community. And they set out a number of measures in the next slide. The model, Singapore is obviously fairly at the forefront of vaccinations. They expect 2/3 of adults to be fully vaccinated by August. They do foresee regular booster shots like the flu jab for us to get, especially with variants. Unlike, let's say, New Zealand, they're not adopting a zero COVID strategy. They recognize that, that elimination is unrealistic. There'll be no blanket quarantine for travelers, but health passports will be there to check vaccination status, and testing will remain crucially. And as they say here, rigorous testing at our borders to identify any person carrying the virus, especially variants of concern. So move on to the next slide. They also said that PCR test, which is the default still in many countries, is cumbersome and expensive. As they say here, it's uncomfortable, takes many hours to produce results. They need to make it fast and easy. And they talked about moving towards rapid antigen tests and also newer experimental tests, breath tests, like from companies like Nanoscent in Israel and also Breathonics in Singapore. And I'll touch upon them just a little bit later. On to the next slide. So what does all this mean? Well, all this means no more paper. I'm actually traveling to the US tomorrow. And I've taken my test from Collinson, one of the test providers. And one of the things that struck me when I received my PDF was how easy a document like that is to Photoshop. And of course, it's an ongoing problem. Digital health passes will have to become the norm. One of the things that I see in the medium to long term is at the end of the lab. So the end of, the end of lab-based PCR tests, or that they start to be phased out in favor of point-of-care molecular tests and monitored self-tests. When you take an antigen test via a telemedicine service, the development of experimental tests, such as 1-minute breath tests at check-in. But the important thing is that some form of health screening testing is here to stay. You think of all the procedures that were identified, that were introduced after 9/11. To give one example, Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, he flew in December 2011 when he tried to put explosives into his shoes. Today, 20 years later, we are still very often having to take our shoes off when we go through security. On to the next slide. So one of the first developments is antigen self-test from travel. And this is a trend that I'm seeing more and more. And I can think of 3 airlines that are doing this: United, Delta, and British Airways. And Delta has teamed up with a telemedicine provider in the States called eMed, where you actually have to order these tests, these Abbott Now tests, direct from eMed. You have to pay $150 for a pack of 6, which I guess if you're traveling as a family is fine, despite the fact that these tests are actually on sale at retail outlets in the US. You get them sent to you, you put them in your luggage, you get to your destination, you do a video call with an advisor. That advisor checks your identity, make sure that you're doing the test properly and not faking it. and issues the fit to fly certificate. British Airways does something very similar. I'm actually doing this in my flight back to the UK. I have an antigen test from a provider called Hughes Healthcare. I'll put in my luggage. The provider I'm using is called Cured. I've scheduled a video call. It'll take 10 minutes, and that advisor will watch me take the test, and I'll be good to go back in the back to the UK. And yesterday, Delta actually announced that they were doing a similar initiative with another health telemedicine provider and another antigen test. So these will become much more the norm. And of course, as a traveler, you much prefer this because you can schedule it at your convenience. These tests are much less invasive, like the Hughes test I'm taking. It's a nasal swab and not a deep throat swab. And it's cheaper too. So I very much see this the future, and more airlines are adopting this. On to the next one. Then what we're seeing is the introduction of rapid molecular self-tests. So molecular tests being lab tests or PCR tests. The one on the left is a company called Visby Medical. They produce this device. It costs about $200. It's fairly expensive at the premium end of the market, but this is a one-use PCR test. So you swab yourself, you put it into that cartridge, takes half an hour, shows the result, you throw it away. And this is being used at LAX right now. The one on the right is a company called Lucira. They do a lab test, which is another type of molecular test. You can buy this for $55 from Amazon in the US and from other outlets. And it's the same principle. You swab yourself, you put it in, you get the result in half an hour, claims 98% sensitivity. And there's also an app where you can verify your results. So this as well, we will see tools like this coming much more to the forefront. On to the next slide. Then we're going to see newer experimental tests. So in Singapore, there's a company called Brithronics, and they do a 1 minute breath test where you essentially breathe into a tube. It's analyzed, and you get the result. These tests hold a lot of promise, and I certainly foresee a future where at check-in you do something like this, and it tests you. But of course, one of the lessons that we've learned over the past year is that governments are quite slow in terms of regulatory approval for these types of testing methods. You see how long it's taken a lot of governments to move away from insisting on PCR tests only. So this is a future, but it's not something I expect to see in wide use over 2021. On to the next slide. Health passports to streamline the airport experience. I've taken a screenshot of my Verifly health pass, which I've done already 2 steps. And apparently, as I'm going to find out tomorrow, at Heathrow Terminal 5, and also in the States at various American Airlines international gateways, they have dedicated check-ins for people who have used the Verifly app to streamline it much faster. And for me, the result was, I had my test result, I uploaded it, it was checked by someone because there was about a 2-hour gap between me uploading it and getting it through. I filled out a form, basically a health record. And then the final step that I've got to do at some point this afternoon is a checklist of things before I go to the airport. After that, I'll be issued a pass and a QR code. And the idea being, well, that it will make the whole process much smoother than obviously if you have someone manually checking various pieces of paper. So obviously this is very much the future, and we're seeing airlines like BA and American Airlines, adopting passes like this. On to the next slide. Of course, one of the big problems is that we're seeing a 2-speed travel world due to the vaccination rollout. I'm aware that there are people from all over the world on this call. If we look at somewhere like India, obviously the vaccination rate is under 5%. Likewise, Australia, which is currently battling problems with the Delta variant, compared to countries like the US, the UK, and Israel. And then onto the final slide, and this actually, I believe, was a question that one of the panelists asked for. One of the things that I'm looking out for is a so-called vaccine hierarchy for travel. And it is the case that the European Union for the EU's health pass has decided that obviously only EMA-approved vaccines are valid for it, which is the AstraZeneca vaccine produced in the UK or produced in the European Union, but bizarrely enough, not the Covishield vaccine, which is AstraZeneca produced by the Serum Institute of India. I agree that this is, it seems overly bureaucratic and overly restrictive, and I'm hoping that the sort of that various countries change their policy. We actually had a hint of this several months ago when I saw an alert from the Irish embassy in the United Arab Emirates, alerting people who had the Covishield vaccine, i.e. the AstraZeneca vaccine from India, that they would not be able to skip hotel quarantine when they arrive back in Dublin by virtue of this not being an EMA approved vaccine. And then for the AstraZeneca vaccine itself, there was a story that appeared, some of you may have seen last week, that Canadian tourists who went to Broadway were unable to get entry to the theatre because the AstraZeneca vaccine has not yet received FDA approval. So this is certainly a sort of an issue, that we'll see going forward. I also saw, that there's a diplomatic spat between China and France because France, as yet, has not authorized the Sinovac and Sinopharm vaccines, which are obviously, used in China and in large parts of the world for entry. So that's just a sort of a quick tour from myself about how I see the future and see things evolving. And of course, I'm around for questions as well.
Thanks a lot, Dirk. Lots of really, really great insights and information. Much appreciated. Quick question. So I guess you are now fully vaccinated, but you still needed to get a test before your travel to the US tomorrow.
I did, but I guess it's sort of that the US is one country which allows you to skip quarantine on the other end if you've been vaccinated. Now, interestingly enough, I've received the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is not FDA approved, but the CDC does seem to have a more liberal interpretation of vaccines because the CDC guidelines say any WHO approved vaccine, which does actually include the Chinese vaccines, is good to skip quarantine for entry.
And my last question, the COVID Green Pass COVID certificate in Europe is being launched as we speak within the EU. So how do you think this will affect the holiday season here in Europe?
Well, I mean, I think it's obviously, it's a very, it's a very positive mood, and it will streamline, sort of the whole experience for, for holidaymakers, especially since it's being issued to EU citizens for free. And in fact, I saw yesterday a report in the newspapers saying that in the UK, the NHS's digital health pass, which I have, and the EU's health passport will be made interoperable, which is of course a rare, in these times, a rare example of UK-EU cooperation. That that the health pass that I have on my phone will be valid for travel in the EU, depending, of course, what happens in terms of in terms of travel restrictions and vice versa, and that the EU health pass will be accepted here. So there's certainly moves happening to make that interoperable, and you would hope for that to happen in other areas of the world too.
But definitely great news indeed. Thanks a lot, Dirk. Much appreciated. Safe travels tomorrow. Enjoy your stay in the US.
Thank you.